Well, we are continuing our series called 66 Books in 52 Weeks. And last week we looked at Ezekiel, very interesting prophet in the Old Testament. And tonight we are looking at the book of Daniel. And so let's just here begin by looking at some of the overviews here. We'll see. I'm going to make this full screen so all of you at home can see this a little better, hopefully. So some of the overviews that you have, and these are these downloadable things that you can purchase, the color overviews here. Let's just see what it says. Daniel is it's the 27th book in the Old Testament. It's got only 12 chapters in it. It is a book of prophecy. And Daniel is one of those characters, one of those individuals that's more familiar to people than others, and probably people that even don't have much church background or Christian background would have heard of the person of Daniel in the lion's den, and those types of things. That writing on the wall. There's some dramatic accounts that take place in here. He was one of the victims of the exile. He went and served as in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian leader. And we'll look a little bit more at the summary of his life here, just a little bit. Here's how these outlines, these one-page summary structures it. It's number one. It's the first part is Daniel's 1 through 6 would be the stories of faith, 3 famous accounts of things that happened in Daniel's life, and then Daniel 7 through 11 are some prophecies, and these are some quite fanciful, dramatic visions that Daniel sees, and we'll look at those in a little bit here. And then finally, Daniel 12 is the closing and the meaning of it. And so this is how this one-page outline structures the book here, and we're going to look at another more detailed outline here in a moment. Here's a key verse from this book. Again, this is one of those books that has a lot of things that you could key in on here. But we'll see here, this is what Daniel is looking forward to during the time when it's telling the account of his life, and also during the place where it is recording his prophecies. So Daniel 2:47, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but itself will endure forever. Ultimately, Daniel, in his visions and in his prophecies, he is predicting a kingdom that will last forever. We know this, having 20/20 vision looking backwards, we know this is that he is referring to the kingdom of God as was brought forth through Christ. Not a political kingdom, but a spiritual kingdom in the hearts of people that advances all over the world. No matter what the political situation, the kingdom of God advances, and it can never be quenched or put out. As Jesus said, the gates of hell will not prevail against the kingdom of God. And so Daniel is seeing this, looking ahead in a vision, seeing these things. Not only that, is Nebuchadnezzar in his dreams that Daniel interprets is seeing these things as well, and Daniel is using this as a way to communicate not only to his Jewish brothers and sisters, but also to the Gentiles through Nebuchadnezzar, through Darius, to Belteshazzar, to the different kings that he worked with in his lifetime. So let's just take a little bit a look at the background of Daniel. So let me switch the slide here. First of all, Daniel the man is this. He was carried into Babylon, and the first assault of Jerusalem in 606 BC. So this is where it was a common practice in that day. The Babylonians would go into a country or a city or a territory, and they would find the best and the brightest, the ones, and they would take them and they would utilize their skills to build their kingdom. And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did. Daniel was one of the wisest visionaries and scholars and people in that time in working for King Nebuchadnezzar as a captive here. Interesting thing about Daniel is that his ministry bridged the entire 70 years of captivity. So it starts with Nebuchadnezzar. It goes all the way through basically to the end of the captivity when just before the Jews would begin to return back to Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple and then rebuilding the wall around the city of Jerusalem. On your outlines there are a few things that you can fill in there. One thing we can know about Daniel is that Daniel was a man of resolve. Right from the get-go, Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, some think that he would have been a teenager at this time. It says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." So he was a man of resolve. He knew his convictions, and he stuck by those convictions, but he did it respectfully. There's a lot to learn from Daniel. Maybe you've heard that old song, "Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose strong, dare to make it known." Daniel was a person of resolve. Another thing that marked Daniel's life was that Daniel was a man of prayer. Later on in Daniel chapter 6, this was when now Darius was king and had taken over the Babylonians here. It says that in Daniel 6 and verse 10, when Daniel had learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So a decree had gone out in the land that nobody was allowed to pray except for to the emperor, to the king. But Daniel, 3 times a day, he went out and he prayed anyway. And I think the key phrase there is he prayed just as he had done before. His total life, every decision he made was paved in prayer. So he was a man of resolve. He was a man of prayer. Another thing you can say about Daniel is that he was a man of prophecy. God gave Daniel messages to proclaim to the people of his day, and those messages ring out even until this present time. It's fair to say that Daniel not only is maybe one of the more famous prophets, but he's one of the more debated prophets of the Old Testament, because there are many different interpretations to some of the things that he predicted. We'll take a look at some of that. And again, this is an overview. I can't cover every aspect of this book, but I think we can get a good overview tonight. So let's just take a look here, first of all, at the structure of the book of Daniel here. So some more background here. This is an interesting fact, the language of the book here. There are several chapters 2 through 7, basically, that were written in Aramaic. The rest was written in Hebrew. So most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. A few chapters in Daniel written in Aramaic. Aramaic was the Gentile and diplomatic language of Daniel's day. So that would have been the diplomatic language of that day. Later on in the days of Christ, this would have been centuries later, Alexander the Great had come in, and the Greeks had conquered and everything. And at that time, in the time of Jesus, or start of the church, Greek was the diplomatic language. Everybody spoke just a little bit of Greek, kind of like English is today. But in that time, Daniel wrote some of the book in Aramaic, and it just reflects the fact that he's in captivity, and he is trying to communicate here to the people that he is around. So now we have another part here is the focus. So again, the first 6 chapters of the book focus mostly on the events in Daniel's life, interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream, then also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his friends, in the fiery furnace. You have Daniel in the lion's den, the handwriting on the wall. Those accounts are all listed in the first 6 chapters of the book. And then the last 6 chapters they focus on Daniel's prophetic visions of the future. And he had these visions, and we look at them, we think, what in the world do these mean? I think we can make some sense out of them as we look at them. So it is true. I think for pure interest, the book of Daniel stands first among the writings of the prophets. There are more commentaries written about the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation than all other books of the Bible combined. And my home preacher would always say that every far-fetched theory of what will happen at the end of time will certainly include something from the book of Daniel. You'll dip into there and find it here, and dip something from Revelation. And I would say this, before we get into all of these prophecies and stuff that we'll look at here, is I would just say this. Maybe you remember that movie. There was a movie with Nicolas Cage in it. And Nicolas Cage, it was called National Treasure. Remember you ever saw that movie? And where somehow he knew all of these clues, and he had to go steal the Declaration of Independence because there was all these secret clues, and if he could find just the right clue and put these numbers together and decipher all this stuff, then he could find all of this gold and this big treasure. Well, some people treat prophecy in the Bible the way Nicolas Cage treated the Declaration of Independence and National Treasure. They think if they can just put these numbers and find all these clues together, then I'm going to get it down. I'm going to know the day and the time and the exact moment when Jesus is going to return, and I'm going to just tell you what's going to happen in the future exactly to the very second. And then you get these people that write these books, 88 Reasons the Lord's going to return in 1988, and maybe just a few years back, remember the Lord was going to return on May the 21st. We were up there packing meals in the attic of the church, packing meals to send them down to Haiti, and it was about 2 o'clock was when the Lord was supposed to return on that day. So as some of this comes down to that approach to the Bible, and I think sometimes it's just well-intentioned people, but I believe that is a misguided approach. I think we can take a wider view and learn a deeper meaning to a lot of these prophecies. So let's get into the outline of Daniel here. So we'll start in chapters 1 through 6, and this is telling the background of Daniel here. So the first part is in Daniel 1 is the captivity and his training in Babylon. So I'm just going to read some verses out of chapter 1. But again, in Daniel 1 and verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." This is when Daniel is taken away. Then, if you skip down to verse 3, going down through verse 7, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility." You can see he's taking the best and the brightest. "Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace." Now, when I read a verse like this, these are times that I can deeply identify with the Bible, handsome, quick-witted, all of those things. So again, this pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar, has taken the best and the brightest to build his own kingdom. So he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. In verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. So they were getting good treatment here as exiles would go. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So you have Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and that's where you get these people that perhaps you've heard these names before. So here you have Daniel. He did not want to be defiled by the food that was offered by the king. This food would have been out of the realm of what a Jewish person would have been allowed to eat. It would have not been the kosher meal or the pure food that God had asked them to, that had commanded the Israelites to eat. And so he asked the king that he would permit that he and his friends eat a vegetarian diet. So I don't know if you'd call him the first vegan or whatever, but so he did this respectfully, and he said, they made an agreement. They would do this for 10 days. And at the end of a 10-day trial period, God blessed Daniel with the ability to understand dreams. And at the end of the 10-day trial period, Daniel and his friends were much more healthy than the others. And so they were allowed to continue, and they were allowed to function in this pagan environment, but they yet were not defiling themselves. So that was chapter 1, and in the midst of this, Daniel is given the ability to understand vision and dreams. And that brings us to Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So now this was quite an interesting trial or test that Daniel was put to here. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he has this dream, and it troubles him greatly, and he wants some of his officials to come in and interpret the dream. Except for it was a catch to it. He goes, okay, if you guys are such good visionaries and prophets and all this stuff, you just tell me, I'm not going to tell you what I dreamt. You tell me my dream and then interpret it. And so that was a pretty high task. And so even his official says, I just don't think we can't do this. And then Daniel was given the opportunity to do this. And Daniel did tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was, and then he interpreted the dream. And so this gave Daniel an opportunity to be set apart from all of the other visionaries or magicians and things, that he was actually genuinely empowered by God to give these visions. So if you look down in Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 31 through 35, this is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and this is Daniel describing it. It says, Your Majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold. Its chest and arms were of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of baked clay. And while you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So, let's just go on the back of your outline, and also here on the screen here, we're going to show the statue here. This is an artist rendering of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And so, as you see here on the top there, you have the head of gold, the breast and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs of iron, the feet and toes of clay. And most people take this to mean this is what this is talking about. The head is the Babylonian Empire, and we kind of know that for sure. The next empire was the Medes and the Persian Empire. They conquered the Babylonians. After that was the Macedonian Empire. Greeks came in, Alexander the Great. And then you have the legs of iron representing the Roman Empire, and the feet and toes of clay, kingdoms that arose after the fall of the Roman Empire. But the big message is, it's not just exactly who all these kingdoms are, but it's this big rock that was hewn out of the earth, but not by human hands. And what did this rock do to the statue? Do you remember? It smashed it to pieces, and it just all went away like chaff in the wind in summertime. And so he dreams of this large statue with metals in it and a stone that crushed it. And so, again, none of the astrologers could do it. And he ordered their execution. And Daniel said, hey, don't kill these guys. Let me interpret this dream for you. So he gains favor with Nebuchadnezzar, and he also gains favor with these other guys because he prevented them from being killed as well. So here is the main interpretation, and you're going to see this repeated over and over again. This is a giant interpretation of this. All earthly kingdoms will pass away, no matter how intimidating, how strong, how ferocious they might be, how violent they might be. All earthly kingdoms will pass away, but the kingdom of God will remain forever. I think it's interesting that Jesus used the term when he said to Peter, on this rock I will build my church. The kingdom of God will remain. There is a spiritual kingdom that will never pass away, that supersedes all of this. And so that is the interpretation, that is the dream. So Daniel gained favor with Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel gained favor and respect of the other astrologers and those that were interpreting these things. One more thing to put into this is Daniel's role in this is, if you think ahead 4 or 5 centuries later, when Jesus Christ is born, you might remember from the east came what? Came the wise men, or the magi, they call them. And they come from the east, and they knew to look for this star, and they knew that the king had been born. They knew something about, there was a prophecy or a prediction about a prophet, about a Messiah being born, a king being born. How on earth would they know that just from their own pagan writings and things? Daniel and the other Jews had an influence in this pagan culture, and it lasted all the way up until the time of Christ. Now, they were still very much a pagan culture, but the Hebrew scriptures had been made known in this time, and so they had, the scholars had studied them. That's why you have these magi coming from the east. Daniel is planting these seeds. I just firmly believe that this is where eventually you get the magi coming to see Christ. So that's fast forwarding. Now let's go back to the time of Daniel. Daniel chapter 3, and we get to the fiery furnace here. This is where we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down before the king's golden image. So the king built this golden image. It was like 90 feet tall, and he commanded, if once you hear that we're going to make this noise and blow these trumpets, and once we do that, everybody needs to bow down their knees and bow down. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to do that. They said they refused to do it, and then they come before the king. The king says, well, I'm going to kill you for this. I'm going to throw you into this fiery furnace. And they said, well, we firmly believe that if you throw us into the furnace, that God will save us. But here, to me, is an amazing statement of faith. Is that God will save us, but even if he does not, we will not bow to this statue here. And so that type of faith, that even if faith, even if things don't work out the way we want them, we're going to obey God. And so he had them thrown into this furnace. It's a big dramatic story. The king looks in, and it was reported to him he could look in and see that not only were there 3 men in there, that there was a 4th in there that said something like the son of the gods is the way he described it. And so they were pulled out. The 3 men weren't burned. They didn't even smell like smoke. Nothing like that. And so then the king decreed that anyone who spoke against the God of the Israelites would be punished. So Nebuchadnezzar again is seeing the power of God through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then you have the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and that is recorded in Daniel chapter 4. So in this chapter here, the king dreams of a tree that was cut down to a stump, and Daniel interpreted this dream as the fact that the king would be humbled. And verses 28 through 33 kind of highlight this event. The king does humble himself before God, and some of this is written by Nebuchadnezzar in the first person. Daniel must have utilized some of the king's personal records, and he puts some of the king's personal records into this to tell the story here. So let me just read some of this, beginning in Daniel 4, beginning in verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my power and for the glory of my majesty?" Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people, ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. In verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, he's writing here, these are some of his own records here, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. And many people think that Nebuchadnezzar did indeed come to believe in the Most High God. And so whether he was saved, there's a little mystery to that, but he was humbled. He did look up and acknowledge God. And so it's kind of an interesting thing here. This is a pagan king, and there's some influence there. Now, that brings us, though, to Daniel chapter 5. This is the pagan culture, and, of course, human nature being what it is, pride rears its ugly head. And so we have Belshazzar and the handwriting on the wall. Now, some scholars say that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Some say that he was the grandson, and there's some just different language there that people debate on over that. But Belshazzar, he profaned God's temple. He takes some of the holy artifacts, articles that was taken from the temple, and uses those in a pagan ritual and his pagan party and revelry. And God interrupts his party with a divine message on a wall. So a handwriting comes up, and this message is written out on the wall. They could just see this hand writing there. And so Daniel is called to interpret it. Isn't it interesting? All through Daniel's life, there's a message. What does this mean? Let's get Daniel. So Daniel comes to interpret it. The meaning was that Belshazzar would die very soon, and the Babylonian Empire would come to an end. Full of pride, I'm 10 feet tall and bulletproof, but yet the Babylonian Empire is going to come to an end. And so Daniel, time and again, is called upon as the only one able to truly interpret the visions and dreams. And that very evening, Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And so when we get to chapter 6, which is Daniel in the lion's den, it's no longer Babylon in charge of this land. It's the Medes and the Persians. And so a new leader came to power named Darius. And so Daniel and Darius seemed to get along very well. Darius seemed to have respect for Daniel. And so there were others in the kingdom here that were jealous of Daniel and his position and his influence with King Darius, and so they devised a way that they could get rid of Daniel. They wanted to get him executed. So how did they do this? They tricked the king into making a decree that for a certain amount of time that it would be illegal for anyone to pray to anyone else besides the king. So they coming into the king, they kind of dupe him into signing this measure, and they're also playing on his pride. Well, okay, that sounds reasonable. I am the king. Nobody should pray to me. For the next 30 days, we shouldn't allow this to happen. But they're setting this up. The enemies of Daniel are setting this up so that he could be trapped. So during this time, as was his custom, 3 times a day, what did Daniel do? He opened up his window and he prayed to God. Well, then he was arrested, and the king was very troubled that then he had to throw Daniel into the lion's den to be executed. The king didn't sleep all night. He was very upset over this. He knew that Daniel was an innocent person, did not deserve this. And of course, that evening, the mouths of the lions were closed. They did not consume Daniel. And then after this, the king came along, and in true pagan form, he had those who had accused Daniel thrown into the lion's den along with their families, and they were all eaten up. So very barbaric times, and that's just kind of how things went in that day. But Daniel was spared, and he was faithful to the Lord, and God honored that. So that is the historic section of Daniel here. So now this brings us to the prophetic section here. So we're going to read some here, and I'm going to make some applications, and so we'll go through this, chapters 7 through 12. So chapter 7 is the 4 beasts. All right, so let me just read verses 1 through 8. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven turning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up from the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looks like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given the authority to rule. After that, in my vision that night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. And while I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully." I'm going to skip down to verse 11 of Daniel 7. "Then I continued to watch. Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority and glory and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So, we could get bogged down in horns and animals and all of those things, but there is an overriding message to all of this. You've got the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then you have the super beast, the horrible beast that's described there. And what happens to all of them? They are all destroyed. And God ultimately reigns. So, the main message you can take from this is that God will ultimately reign over all arrogant kingdoms. All the arrogant kingdoms and power of the world will pass away, but God's kingdom will live forever. Now, that brings us to Daniel chapter 8. So, we looked at this, we have our morning men's Bible study, and we actually went through this chapter in detail today. And so, as you look at this, there's a vision of a ram and a goat, and how this was all working together here. And the idea is that many feel that this is revealing the Jews under the Medo-Persian, the Greek empires, and that Greece would conquer Persia, and eventually Alexander the Great emerged. The 4 generals will succeed him, and one king would arise and remove regular sacrifices in the temple and persecute the Jews. They say that many people think that this is referring to the Syrian king Antiochus in 150 BC, 150 years before Christ. Actually, this Antiochus, it said that he actually sacrificed pigs on the altar in the temple and defiled it that way. He was known as the Great Defiler. And so you have this vision here in chapter 8 of this. But again, as you read, if you read through chapter 8, you see the same thing again. No matter how intimidating and powerful an evil kingdom might seem, God ultimately reigns and is victorious. So now here's the next one here. Daniel's prayer and the 77s. Okay, so in verses 1 through 19, Daniel prays that God would restore his people. And then he's given an answer by Gabriel. Gabriel is one of 2 of the angels that are named in the Bible. You have Gabriel and then you have Michael. Now, if you could count Lucifer, who was a fallen angel that became our enemy, the devil, but Gabriel is mentioned by name as an angel here. And so you have this 77s. Now, so much debate over this here. So I'm just going to show you what these things could possibly mean. What's this referring to? Some scholars say that the possible interpretation is that because of sin and rebellion, even in captivity, that Israel's oppression was going to continue 7 times longer than even Jeremiah had envisioned. And so that some of these persecutions of the Jews, even after they had come back and restored the temple and things, that this was talking about further persecution in their days. It's going to be 7 times longer than had thought. And so using that way. And some people add up these times and say, well, this is predicting the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the subsequent rebuilding, kind of adding up there. Some people say that this is what the 77s, referring to times, is what this is about. And then, again, some claim that this is just kind of looking forward and referring to the events that are surrounding the second coming of Christ. And ultimately, I think we need to be very careful of taking numbers like this too literally. You know, we use numbers in a figurative way a lot of times. How many times does somebody, maybe if you're raising your children and you say, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Well, have you counted? Did you really count that you told them 1,000 times? You're just using this as a way to get a point across. And so this is symbolic of some period of time that God was going to work in a solid way. And so there's many different interpretations of this. And so just showing that's what that is there. And then, again, another pattern here. Daniel's chapter 10 through 11. The rise and fall of several kingdoms. So again, Daniel is given a review of a series of kingdoms that would rise and fall. Persia, Greece, kings of the north and kings of the south. Do you see a pattern here? The pattern is kingdoms rise, but they go away. But there's one kingdom that will remain forever. It's kind of interesting if you look at this, if you would look at the book of Revelation through this same kind of filter there, you can kind of get that same understanding from that. In the book of Revelation, you see these visions of beasts and horrible things and persecutions, and ultimately, God is the victor over all of this. So we see that, and then this brings us here down to Daniel chapter 12, instructions concerning the end times. And so let me just read to you from Daniel 12, beginning in verse 2. It says this: multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. So Daniel is given a vision of ultimately we will stand before God in judgment. And then I like these final words to Daniel. Daniel 12:13. As for you, go your way till the end, you will rest, and then at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. Isn't this like an image of what's to come? You can kind of see some glimpses of what is to come in the New Testament. And so this brings us down to what are the lessons, what are the application we can get from this book here. First of all, Daniel's life story serves as an example of faithfulness in the midst of difficult times. I firmly believe that we live in a culture that is moving farther and farther away from God. And there's going to be more and more times when people who seek to live by faith in God are going to be put in very difficult circumstances, just like Daniel was put in. It might be threatening of the loss of a job. It might be threatening of some other things happening to their lives. And so Daniel serves as an example of faithfulness in the midst of difficult times. He was respectful to the people around him, but ultimately he was faithful to God. And secondly here, and I stole this from some other resources here, Daniel's prophecy reminds us of a pattern and a promise that applies to all generations. A lot of these prophecies, remember, have multiple applications that you can apply here. Here is the pattern. The pattern we see: human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they refuse to acknowledge God as sovereign. Nebuchadnezzar literally became like a beast, became like an ox. But then you have the visions of the beast. They just seem so intimidating. And the other thing they had in common is they were intimidating, but they were also all arrogant, and they came to be humbled. And then here's the promise there, if you want to fill this in. One day, God will confront the beasts. You can put whatever beast in there you want. One day, God will confront that and rescue his people. One day, all arrogant kingdoms will pass away, and God will remain sovereign forever. So that is the account of Daniel and all of the prophecies, and I hope that made some sense for you here this evening.